the macabre history of the Halberts. They never buried their dead. They say the woods behind the Halbert house never fall completely silent, even in winter. Nestled in the hills of Fayette County, Pennsylvania, the town of Briar Glen is a place that doesn't make headlines. It never grew large enough to be called a city, nor quiet enough to be called forgotten. The old coal roads and crumbling iron bridges speak of a former era, while its people, tough, practical, insular, carry the quiet legacy of generations who lived and died on land soaked with history and more than a little superstition. It is a town where folklore and fact have long held hands in uneasy silence, but in the summer of 1999, a discovery made on the outskirts of Briar Glen turned local legend into national obsession. For decades, rumors had swirled around the Halbert family. Whispers of isolation, of strange lights seen at night, of missing persons and odd, acrid smells that wafted from the woods after rain. The family lived in a sagging colonial farmhouse about 6 miles from town, on property bordered by dead trees and encroaching vines. Their land was dense, unkempt, and swarmed with the kind of insects not seen in other parts of the region. The soil was oddly soft, even in dry weather. It was the kind of place children dared each other to approach, and no one ever did twice. The Halberts had lived there since 1901, when Ernest Halbert, a former mortician from Allegheny County, purchased 20 acres of forested land and built the house himself. The structure, while large, had always struck neighbors as more mausoleum than home. Granite foundation stones jutted from the ground like headstones, and the family's penchant for silence earned them a reputation for eerie decorum. They rarely attended town functions except funerals, and they never buried their dead, not in any cemetery Briar Glen could account for. What began as a strange family quirk evolved into something far more sinister, when in late July of 1999, a local search and rescue volunteer named Chelsea Cray found a human femur protruding from the hillside near the Halbert property line. She had been looking for a lost hiker, 22-year-old Ben Kincaid, missing for 3 days. Cray later told the Pennsylvania State Police, "At first I thought it was from a deer. You find bones out there all the time, but it was too clean, too straight. I bent down and brushed the dirt away. There were shoe prints. Someone had been there recently. The femur was indeed human, and it was not Ben Kincaid's. It belonged to Margaret Halbert, age 89, last seen alive in 1984. The official record stated that Margaret had died of congestive heart failure, yet no death certificate was ever filed in Fayette County, and no burial record existed in any registered cemetery. Her name, like so many of her kin, had simply disappeared from the public record. Investigators searched the Halbert property and uncovered 27 more sets of remains. Among them were family members long presumed dead, or relocated, as the town had always been told, along with 2 missing persons reported over the past decade. All had been buried in shallow graves, some dismembered, many partially preserved. The coroner's report from the time described the findings as unprecedented in both number and condition, citing signs of chemical embalming agents, and in some cases evidence of repeated post-mortem manipulation. Dr. Samuel Greaves, who led the forensic team, described the site in haunting detail. There was evidence that the corpses had not been placed there immediately after death. Some had been stored, preserved. Others showed signs of what we can only call ritual positioning. It's as though someone tried to delay the process of decay indefinitely. I've never seen anything like it. The case would come to involve federal investigators, anthropologists, and folklorists. But the deeper authorities dug, the stranger it became, until they were no longer certain where science ended and something else began. The Halberts were not, by legal standards, a large family. At the time of the 1999 investigation, only 3 surviving members remained at the homestead: Thomas Halbert, 58, his sister Agnes, 61, and their mother Lillian, a bedridden woman in her 90s, rumored to have gone blind years earlier. No birth certificate existed for any of them. In fact, most official documentation had been lost, destroyed, or never filed at all. The town had simply accepted the Halberts' presence. Much like the trees or the stone walls that lined the old trails, they were part of the landscape, unquestioned. But certain people had begun asking questions even years before the discovery. Sheriff Wayne McTavish, now retired, agreed to speak on the condition his interview be included only posthumously. He passed in 2018. "I visited that house in 1987, he said in a recording recovered by journalist Aaron Mallory. Got called out there because someone, I won't say who, claimed they'd heard screaming, night after night. So I drive up, knock on the door, and Thomas Halbert answers in a black suit. Mid-July. He doesn't sweat, doesn't blink, just says, 'No trouble here, Sheriff. Just my mother and my prayers.' And he closed the door. The complaint was dropped. No one else reported disturbances, at least not officially. Unofficially, however, something had been wrong for a very long time. In an unsigned letter delivered to Briar Glen's local paper, the Mountain Courier, in 1992, the author wrote, "The Halberts don't bury, they keep. They preserve what they love, and they've learned how to keep it from smelling." The letter was dismissed as a hoax. It wasn't the first. According to old Courier archives, similar rumors had persisted since at least 1937. Local children claimed they saw faces in the attic windows long after funerals had been held. One former town clerk, Anna Grace Benton, told a producer from Allegheny Mysteries that the Halberts always sent the same black envelopes for every death. No flowers, no tears, just an invitation to remember in silence. Who the phrase would appear again scrawled on parchment paper, found inside a sealed chest in the Halbert basement. Investigators cataloged over 90 such envelopes, each one dated and marked with a name. Some of those names matched the remains found outside, but not all of them. Among the more chilling discoveries was a locked room in the rear of the basement, sealed not just with a modern deadbolt, but iron nails driven through the doorframe, 11 in total. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves. Upon those shelves sat what forensic anthropologists described as biologically anomalous vessels. Glass jars, some cracked with age, containing preserved fragments, eyes, teeth, finger bones, each labeled with hand-written tags, and in the center of the room, draped in black velvet, stood an embalming table. Detective Marion Thorne, who worked the case from 1999 to 2001, described her first impressions of the scene. It was quiet, too quiet for a house that size, and cold. Not the kind of cold that comes from drafty windows, deeper, more internal, like the air had been refrigerated, but not by any machine. I remember the smell, not rotting, not fresh, chemical, and sweet, like burnt sugar over something dead. Thomas Halbert was arrested on July 29, 1990, and Lillian were taken into protective custody. The charges included illegal disposal of human remains, obstruction of justice, and unlawful imprisonment. But those were only the beginning. As forensic work continued and more bodies were identified, new questions emerged, not just of legality but of intention. Because some of the dead, including 2 strangers, had no connection to the Halbert family at all, and none of them had died of natural causes. Neighbors described the Halberts as distant, formal, and oddly timeless. One former mail carrier, Jeremy Lovell, noted they always dressed as though they were frozen in the 1920s. Long skirts, black veils, high collars, topcoats, gloves. Never a hello, never a wave. Local children called them the Black Ghosts, yet the family was never hostile, never aggressive. In fact, some described their politeness as downright unnerving. They spoke like old textbooks, said Briar Glen librarian Martha Henley. Not conversationally, just pronouncements, like they'd memorized a script. Once, Agnes came in asking for a book on mycology. I said we only had the basics, and she said, "The fungi we seek are deeper than spores, Miss Henley. They are echoes of breath returned to soil." I didn't sleep right for a week after that. The Halberts grew their own food, kept to themselves, and never appeared at town meetings or school functions. There was no record of Thomas or Agnes attending school past the age of 10, yet both were fluent in Latin, German, and French, skills not taught anywhere in the county. It was as if the family had constructed their own world inside the woods, and beneath that world, they had hidden another. As the investigation deepened, authorities focused on uncovering the Halberts' past. They traced land deeds, birth records, and military registries, but time and again they ran into silence. Gaps. Entire generations of Halberts existed only in scribbled family Bibles or faded photographs. No school records, no tax filings, no hospital visits. In 2000, a special inquiry was made into the family's origins. Specifically, Ernest Halbert, the patriarch who founded the estate. His obituary, discovered in a Pittsburgh mortuary journal from 1943, hinted at practices unfit for modern mortuary science, and referenced his sudden departure from the city in 1900 under the suspicion of anatomical impropriety. The phrase was never legally defined. No criminal charges had been filed, but a personal journal, believed to be Ernest's, was found behind a false wall in the Halbert study. It described early attempts to preserve memory through the flesh, referencing techniques more akin to spiritual rites than medical preservation. One passage read, "The body is but a vessel, but through stillness and chemical devotion it becomes a mirror. In the mirror we see the soul's memory, and if that memory can be held, so too may the soul be convinced to remain." The implications of this journal shook even the most skeptical investigators, because the Halberts, it seemed, had not merely failed to bury their dead, they had chosen to keep them. And if the writings were to be believed, they had done so in the hope that death itself might one day be undone. The macabre history of the Halberts. They never buried their dead. Thomas Halbert never once denied the charges brought against him. During his arraignment in Uniontown, he spoke only when addressed, and even then, his answers were minimal, polite, and delivered with the same antique cadence neighbors had described for years. He declined legal counsel and entered a plea of not guilty by moral exception, a term that baffled both the court and the attending media. Transcripts from that hearing capture a moment of unsettling clarity. When asked why so many bodies had been discovered on the Halbert property, Thomas answered, "Because we are the custodians of silence, the keepers of the hushed threshold." These were not murders. These were remembrances. The prosecution would spend the next 2 years untangling what exactly that meant. Of the 29 sets of remains uncovered in the first search, 17 were positively identified through dental records and DNA matching. Among them were members of the Halbert lineage: Ruth Halbert d. 1948, Edmund Halbert d. 1951, Charlotte Halbert d. 1963, and others, all previously presumed buried in private ceremonies. The remaining 12 were a mixture of unidentified adults and adolescents, with various indicators of death by asphyxiation, blunt force trauma, or chemical interference. But the real mystery lay in the condition of the bodies. Multiple cadavers had been partially preserved with formaldehyde and phenol, injected post-mortem in patterns inconsistent with professional embalming. In several cases, small incisions had been made along the wrists and ankles, where glass tubing had been inserted. It appeared the Halberts had created a homemade perfusion system, possibly to maintain fluid circulation post-mortem. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Elena Yarrow, who examined the remains for the state medical examiner's office, described her findings in a 2001 deposition. It was as though someone had tried to create a second vascular system. In a few of the bodies, you could see veins artificially reinforced with surgical thread, almost like someone was trying to make them withstand pressure long after death. But why? Investigators turned to folklore experts and historians for context. One name kept recurring: the threshold doctrine, an obscure spiritualist belief rooted in 19th century Appalachian mortuary cults. According to research conducted by Dr. Harold Coleridge at Temple University, certain sects believed death was not an immediate departure but a liminal state, threshold, during which the soul lingered near its body, awaiting either release or invitation. To preserve the dead was to preserve the soul's tether, and to delay decay was to hold the soul near indefinitely. It's archaic, Coleridge told authorities, but not unheard of. These beliefs were especially common in isolated, rural communities that distrusted formal religion. They believed memory and physicality were tied together, that to forget the face, or let the flesh rot, was to consign a soul to oblivion. The Halberts had apparently taken this doctrine to an extreme. Further searches of the estate revealed hand-written texts, many bound in leather and wrapped in muslin cloth. These texts were part spiritual manual, part technical guide. Diagrams showed musculature marked with alchemical symbols. One page bore a list of dates and names, followed by phrases in Latin, such as memoria obligat anime, memory binds the soul. Authorities also found recordings, audio tapes labeled by year, stored in a lead-lined cabinet beneath the study floorboards, the earliest dated to 1953. On these tapes, a male voice, presumably Ernest or Edmund Halbert, recites lengthy monologues. Some appear to be prayers, others are instructions. But one, dated July 18, 1961, is simply labeled, Whispering Room Lights. In it, the speaker recounts an event with breathless reverence. She moved, not of her own will perhaps, but the fingers twitched, the lips parted. I heard no words, but I felt presence. She knew me, she remembered. That tape was never made public, but excerpts were played during pre-trial hearings to establish the Halberts' intent. In the background of several recordings, investigators noted faint breathing, too irregular to belong to the speaker, and on at least one occasion, the soft sound of weeping. Agnes Halbert was kept under psychiatric observation for 7 months before being declared unfit for trial. Interviews conducted with her during that period remain sealed, but psychiatric notes released through a FI request describe a woman dissociated from present reality, yet uncannily lucid. When discussing family history, she often spoke of the unforgotten, a term she used to describe the preserved dead. They are with us, she reportedly told Dr. Lisa Chow, not beneath, not above. With the unforgotten wait for the age of return, but they grow impatient. We try to keep them soothed. You see, we sang to them. We burned myrrh and ash, but the new ones, they don't sleep the same. Her statement suggested the family believed they had begun to lose control over what they had created. In October of 2000, excavation behind the Halbert house uncovered a second burial field, this one much older, nearly erased by time. Carbon dating placed the earliest remains at approximately 1912, just a decade after Ernest Halbert built the estate. These bodies showed more primitive embalming attempts: tree resin, ash, dried herbs, but 2 of the cadavers were completely encased in wax. When forensic teams opened the wax shells, they discovered remarkably preserved faces, eyes open, mouths slightly agape, as though caught mid-expression. Both were female. Neither matched any known relative or missing person in Pennsylvania records. The wax had formed a near-perfect seal. Internal organs were desiccated but intact. According to Dr. Greaves, it was preservation beyond what anyone could have expected from such rudimentary materials. But it wasn't done for science. It was done for memory. These weren't corpses to the Halberts. They were keepsakes. The implication was clear. The Halberts had not simply been preserving their loved ones. They had been collecting. Among the more disturbing revelations came in late 2001, when a series of coded journals was deciphered. Hidden within what initially appeared to be gibberish Latin were names, Over 100 of them, many of whom had been reported missing across the Tree State area between 1930 and 1990. Not all were traceable, but several matched real cases, including 2 children who vanished from a church picnic in Greensburg in 1959. Their bodies were never found. While no direct physical evidence tied the Halberts to these disappearances, the pattern was undeniable. And yet, charges could only be filed on those cases where remains had been recovered. The question lingered: how many more were there? Lillian Halbert passed away in state care in 2003. Her final weeks were marked by silence, punctuated only by occasional whispered fragments in German and Latin. She never spoke publicly about the case nor expressed remorse. One attending nurse, who asked to remain anonymous, recalled her final words: "Verges das Jesset nicht, Dan Blades. Forget not the face, then it stays." Thomas Halbert remained in custody, undergoing evaluations and intermittent court appearances until his sudden death in 2004 due to complications from untreated pneumonia. He left no will, no final statement. His burial site was kept confidential, at the request of the county, citing fears of grave tampering. Agnes Halbert resides in a long-term psychiatric care facility. She no longer speaks. The Halbert estate was razed in 2005. State officials declared the structure unsalvageable and contaminated. But before demolition, a final inspection was conducted. Deep in the basement, workers uncovered one last door, metal, riveted shut, hidden behind shelving. Inside was a small room barely 5 feet across. It was empty save for a single child-sized chair facing a wall. On the wall, etched faintly into the stone, was a sentence: "I remember you still." Authorities never determined its origin. The macabre history of the Halberts. They never buried their dead. Final chapter. By the time the full scope of the Halbert case came into focus, public imagination had turned to obsession. The story spread beyond Fayette County, beyond Pennsylvania, crossing state lines and cultural boundaries. Reporters from the Philadelphia Inquirer to Le Monde ran stories often accompanied by grainy black and white photos of the Halbert estate, shadowed and crumbling like a haunted relic. But the media could never quite grasp what had happened. Was it a family of necrophiles, a hidden cult, a delusional lineage kept alive by superstition and isolation? Or was it something older? A belief system buried under centuries of modernity, now exposed like a nerve? None of these were fully right. None were fully wrong. After the razing of the Halbert home, the land itself was left untouched, declared unsuitable for development due to the presence of residual embalming agents and human remains. The earth there had become something different. Local farmers stopped hunting within a mile radius. Children were told not to cross its borders. Even wildlife patterns seemed to change. Deer began avoiding the region, and dogs brought their refuse to go near the old perimeter fence. Locals began referring to it as the still ground. In 2006, a state commission review board published a 312-page report titled The Halbert Inquiry: Cultural Isolation, Institutional Oversight, and Mortuary Deviance in Rural Pennsylvania. The findings were blunt. They concluded that multiple generations of county officials had failed to monitor the Halbert family due to a mixture of social deference, bureaucratic neglect, and rural exceptionalism. Medical deaths were rarely verified. Burial records were taken at face value. No official had set foot inside the Halbert residence for over 30 years prior to the investigation. A single paragraph from the report still haunts those who worked on it. It is the opinion of this board that the Halbert family did not operate as a criminal enterprise, nor as an organized cult. Rather, they represent a closed system of belief, insulated by tradition and untouched by the passage of time. The preservation of the dead was not incidental. It was their core identity. To them, to bury the body was to erase the soul. Their horror is not rooted in hatred or sadism. It is rooted in devotion. Devotion. That word struck a chord. In the months following publication, memorial shrines began appearing at the still ground's edges, not by relatives of victims but by strangers. Candles, black ribbons, framed photographs of unidentified faces. Some believed the Halberts had, in their own grotesque way, preserved more than just bodies. They had preserved memory. And memory, some whispered, was sacred. There were copycats. In 2007, a man in Vermont was arrested after attempting to preserve the body of his deceased mother using instructions found online, allegedly based on the Halbert notes. He claimed she had spoken to him from the air, and that she was not ready to be forgotten. In 2011, authorities in West Virginia uncovered a makeshift embalming table in a church basement with signs of amateur chemical use. But none matched the scale or commitment of the Halberts. None had generations of method. None had walls lined with name books. None had rooms built just to whisper to the dead. Today, the surviving Halbert documents, the ledgers, the tapes, the illustrated manuals, are kept under lock at a secure archive at the University of Pennsylvania. Access is limited to credentialed researchers, but even they are cautious. Dr. Elaine Bauer, who cataloged the material for her PhD in 2014, spoke briefly in a rare public lecture. It's not what's in the text that disturbs, it's the tone. There's no malice, no drama, no madness, only method, reverence, the belief that to remember someone, To truly remember them is to house them within you. They believed their memory was literal shelter, and so they built a house for it. She paused, then added, but if memory becomes shelter, what happens when it molds, when it rots? There is one final detail, not found in any report and never acknowledged in court. It concerns the last journal recovered from the Halbert estate, water damaged but intact. Its last entry dated March 14, 2000, 3 days before the anonymous tip that triggered the investigation, reads as follows. The line thins. The names fade even here, even in the bone. Agnes weeps when she tends to them. Thomas sings the names too quickly now. I hear murmuring in the wax, but it is no longer the voices I knew. It is something else, something gathering. I think we waited too long. I think they want to leave, but they don't remember how. So the handwriting is believed to be Lillian Halberts. In the years since, laws have changed in Pennsylvania. Home burials are now more strictly regulated. Periodic audits are required of private estates with known family cemeteries. Counties have strengthened their oversight of death certification and interment. But legislation can only address the surface. What lingers is not just legal failure, but cultural blindness, the assumption that isolation is harmless. That tradition is always benign. That memory left to rot in silence cannot soar. The Halberts lived among their dead. They spoke to them, tended to them, preserved them, and in doing so, may have opened a door they could not close. They did not fear death. They feared forgetting, and in their fear they created something worse than death, something quieter, slower, still. Today, if you drive past the still ground, just off Old Mill Creek Road, a mile outside Ridgeton, you'll see no markers, no fence, no sign of what once stood there. But some say that if you roll down your window in the early evening, just as the mist settles low, you'll hear something fade in the trees. Not a cry, not a howl, just names, whispered one by one, over and over again, as though they're still being remembered by someone or something that never learned how to forget.